what's going on, guys? Felix here from the Podcast Promotion Blueprint course. And I thought I would give you guys a little bit of a behind the scenes of what it is like to run a million download podcast. And this is the system I'm about to show you to keep everything organized that got me from just a handful of listeners into a million download podcast. And I grew it all using this system I show you here that helps you plan, figure out when to record, how to schedule each episode, how to publish each episode, how to promote each episode when it goes out. And it's all inside the system, but I'll show you guys here a little bit behind the scenes. And I'll run this entire operation, this million download podcast that's earned me a full-time income, full-time living, all from my home right here, my setup right here, my microphone right here, this recording computer right here, all inside. And I'm going to show you guys the system that I use to do all of that. Let's go check it out.
All right, guys, so this is the inside the system that I use to run my million download podcast. I've been using this system from almost at the very beginning when I only had a handful of listeners. It's expanded since then, right? This looks intimidating at first, but I walk through and I show you guys how it all works. So it all starts off with us trying to find guests to come on the show. So I've detailed all the processes here of how everything's done, how we upload, how we get transcripts, finding links, what the show notes are, and the template, the monthly reports. By the way, inside the Podcast Promotion Blueprint program, you get access to all of this. You get access to my entire system of how I manage the entire podcast. So once we find the guests that we want to come on the show, we reach out to them, ask them if they want to come on the show. And if they do, they make it into our system here. And sometimes they don't respond. Like these are a list of guests that we want on the show that have not responded. You can think of these as different episodes, right? We have an interview per episode. If you do not have interview-based podcasts, you can still use the system. But what we have is this extra list then, or not extra list, but we have this list here for anyone that we reached out to that did not respond. We keep them here just in case in the future we want to reach back out to them and maybe they changed their mind or maybe they just didn't see it the first time and do want to come on the podcast. Now, when they do agree to come on the show, we send them a type form. This was what we call the pre-interview form. And the reason why we do that is because we want them to fill out the form so that we can have a really good understanding of what it will be like when we have them on the podcast. Because ideally, I want to have an idea, an image, a painting in my mind of what that end podcast is going to look like even before we ever hit record, because that will really help you kind of guide the path of the interview, guide the path of the interview. So here's the form that we use. So first, my podcast is called Shopify Masters, so we care about their URL. So let me just kind of walk you guys through this real quick. I will say this is a test.com, hit OK. What is your Shopify store called? Test store. This is just for demo purposes. Okay. Full name of store owner. So Felix Tia. Okay. Store owner's guest email. Felix at podcastingSecrets.co. Elevator pitch for your business. So this is an important one, which is that we want them to give us their description. Like, what is their bio? What's their one-liner about them? Because I don't want to come up with it myself. I want them to say it, and from there, I could certainly kind of tweak it when I introduce them on the podcast. But it's always good to get them to tell you how they perceive themselves. I can say, Felix is a podcast. I just keep it test for now. But basically, so this example, Linger is a store. Linger sells minimalist goods made with the finest natural materials. You have a different podcast. Obviously, the guest that comes on the show is going to describe themselves differently than if they were a store. Why did you start this business? So the same thing. If you have obviously a non-business podcast, you can say, it depends on your niche, right? If you have a career-based podcast, you would change this to why did you choose this as a career? If you have a relationship podcast, you can say, why did you choose this expertise? Basically, you want to get them to tell their kind of reason for them to go down the path that they're on. Okay, so I'm just going to put a test here. Just keep it moving. Share your story. What can Shopify Masters listeners learn from your website? So this is an important one. So I asked them, what can my listeners learn from you? And the reason why I asking this question is because the answer here is ideally going to be the center, the focus of that podcast episode. So what can your listeners learn from me? Let's say I have a career advice podcast. I could say, or career advice. If I'm a guest on a career advice podcast, I could say, as a guest, you guys can learn how to create the best cover letter for your resume, right? Again, the idea is that if someone says that means I know that the episode should be centered around cover letters for resumes. What apps and tools you recommend? This is a really important one because people love to look at show notes for the resources, the tools, the apps, the books, the movies, the documentaries that the guests on the show talk about. So we ask them ahead of time, like, what are some of your favorite apps or tools? You can ask them for what are some of their favorite books or movies or documentaries, whatever makes the most sense in your niche. Get those resources, because then when you create the show notes, it becomes a lot easier, because all this gets produced into a form that gets emailed to you. So what's been your most successful, noteworthy marketing strategy to date? This, again, is very specific to my podcast, but you can say something similar where you can say, what's a success story from you that you can share, right? The idea is to get more information out of them so you can craft the podcast episode. Now, this is very similar to that question earlier about what can they learn, but this one really gets them to put down a one-liner. So what if you were asked to teach one thing to a group of your target listeners, what would be the topic? So to put the answer in here, what's your annual revenue? Obviously, not related for everybody, every podcast. Can you share your revenue with the guests? Again, not super relevant for every podcast. But basically, you don't put any questions that you might want to know the answer to ahead of time, especially when you introduce them. Right? When you introduce them on the podcast, it's very important to have all the details ready here. Upload a high quality image that reflects your store. This is super cool and super important too, because I would use this in my show notes. I can just get them to give me the image that they want in their show notes. Okay, so once that's all done, they submit and I get it inside this field here. This is all automated, and I'll show you guys how to do all of that inside the podcast promotion blueprint course. But this is what it looks like. Once they type in everything, this is exactly the form that's generated inside Trello here. So I don't got to copy paste or anything like that. It automatically makes it right here and spells it all out for me. So when I go on to do the podcast, I have all the information in front of me. So when I introduce the guest, I can say, let's see, the name of the guest is, or the company is called Peace Out Skincare, and Marcella is the guest. I can say, in this podcast episode, I'm joined by Marcella from Peace Out Skincare. And look at the description here. It says, Peace Out Skincare is the beauty tech company behind the magic patches that offer one-step solutions for top skincare concerns like pimples, wrinkles, and dark spots. And then I can go into more details about how I want to craft the interview itself by looking at their answers here, to their vision, to the best marketing strategy, to their subject matter expertise. That, again, is all tied back to the form they just filled out. So once they fill all this out, we look at it, we see if it looks like it would be a good guess. If they are, we move them over to the verified guest column here. And then once we send them over to a tool called Calendly, calendly.com/ I think. Let's see if this works. Awesome. So I sent them into a tool called Calendly, which you guys will learn more about inside the program. And then come in here, book a time. This is tied directly to my calendar. So if for some reason I already have a podcast booked there, or I got a dentist appointment, or I got a meeting or a call, whatever, it will see it in my personal calendar and block off that time and only show available times. If two people would try to book the same time, it obviously will be blocked off and only one person can get through. Once they pick a time here, we then move them over to the interview schedule list. Then once we do the interview, we move over to interview recorded list. Once that's done, we schedule it for a time for it to be released. If it is scheduled for a certain time, you can change this due date here to the exact date when it's going out. So 6/16/2020 was a podcast release date, and it shows up here in the bottom of this little Trello card here, the date, so I can have a good view of when the episodes will go out. Here's a super cool thing too. There's a view called a calendar view inside Trello, which now gives me a calendar view of basically my release schedule, right? I release every Tuesday, and as you can see, I can go all the way back and see all the episodes that got released already, and then also the episodes that are coming up in the future are also listed in this view. Now, once they're scheduled, I usually create a show notes / blog post, and if that's done and created, I move it to the ready for blog post section. And once the podcast episode is released, the blog post is published, I then move it over to launch ready once all the show notes are done. And once that's done, I archive it, and that's it. So these are extra columns for episode ideas, promotion ideas, and other kind of notes. But for the most part, this entire system, it starts off with finding a guest, reaching out to them. If they agree to come on, send them that type form over here. They fill it out. We get it automatically populated inside Trello. And then once we sign off on their submission, we move them over to verified guests. Once we schedule them, we move it over to interview schedule. Once the podcast is recorded, we move it over to interviews recorded. And once it's edited, we actually move it over to edit it, and we have a release date for it. We will move it over to episode scheduled and then publish it. So that's this whole system right here that took me from, again, just a handful of listeners, handful of downloads to over 1.5 million, really, almost 2 million downloads per year podcast. So if that was interesting to you and you want to learn more about creating a system for growing your podcast, right? Because it's all about creating a system. It's not anything that I've done crazy. Like this is all manageable by one person, right? It's all manageable by one person as long as you have a system in place. And you're going to learn more about the system that I use to go from just a handful of listeners, from 50 downloads per episode to 50,000 downloads per episode for my podcast. Then make sure to sign up at podcastpromotionblueprint.com/go. And I'll see you guys inside. Bye-bye.